Kelvin, please, it's too tight, I can't breathe.
Keep quiet, my friends are already waiting. And you can't follow me looking this. You have to fit into it.
Sandra screamed in pain as Kelvin violently squeezed her waist, trying to force her body into a tiny dress that was several sizes too small. "Kelvin, please, you're hurting me," she cried, struggling to breathe as he pulled the dress tighter. "Keep quiet," Kelvin snapped angrily. "My friends are already waiting for us, and I will not walk into that party with a fat wife looking like this." Sandra stared at herself in the mirror, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched Kelvin struggle to force the dress over her body. The more she resisted, the tighter he pulled. "Please, Kelvin, I can't breathe," she whispered. But Kelvin didn't care. He told her that if she wanted to attend the party with him, she had better find a way to fit into the dress. Sandra's hands trembled as she tried again, terrified that refusing him might make him leave her. Then, suddenly, the fabric tore with a loud sound. Kelvin froze, stared at the torn dress, and became furious. Sandra stood there in tears, humiliated and helpless, wondering how the man she once believed loved her had become the person hurting her the most. But how did Sandra, a beautiful and wealthy woman who had everything she could ever want, end up trapped in a marriage where she was treated this way? To understand how everything went wrong, we have to go back to the very beginning. But before we continue with this emotional and dramatic story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support means so much and helps us continue bringing you more powerful stories like this. Sandra was born into a family so wealthy that she never had to worry about the basic things many children prayed for. She was the only child of Mr. Joseph and Mrs. Grace, and to them, she was not simply their daughter, she was their greatest blessing. From the moment Sandra was born, her parents surrounded her with love, attention, and everything they could possibly give her. She grew up in comfort. She never knew what it meant to sleep hungry, wear torn clothes, or worry about whether there would be food the next morning. Whenever Sandra wanted something, her parents did their best to provide it. She received an excellent education and attended prestigious schools. She traveled, wore beautiful clothes, and lived a life many children could only dream about. Yet, despite all the wealth around her, Sandra carried a pain that money could never take away: her weight. Sandra had been plus-sized since childhood, and unfortunately, children could be very cruel. Sometimes, when she walked past other children, they would laugh and whisper about her body. Other times, they said hurtful things directly to her. "Look at how big she is," one child would say. "Why does she walk like that?" another would add, and the others would burst into laughter. Sandra would pretend she did not hear them. She would lift her head and keep walking, trying to convince herself that their words did not matter. Sometimes she would even turn around and proudly say, "My parents say I am the most beautiful girl in the universe." But instead of stopping, the children would laugh even harder. "Did you hear her?" they would tease. Sandra would force a smile and walk away. She tried to be strong in front of everyone, but the moment she got home, that smile disappeared. She would quietly enter her bedroom, close the door, and stand in front of the mirror. She would look at herself for a long time, then touch her stomach and whisper, "Why am I so big? Why can't I look like the other girls?" Sometimes she had no answer. She would sit on her bed, pull her knees close to her chest, and cry until she fell asleep. One evening, Mrs. Grace noticed that Sandra had been unusually quiet. She knocked gently on her daughter's door. "Sandra, can I come in?" There was no answer. She opened the door slowly and found her daughter sitting on the floor beside the bed, tears running down her cheeks. Mrs. Grace's heart broke. She immediately went to her and sat beside her. "My child, what happened?" Sandra wiped her tears quickly. "Nothing, Mama." "Don't tell me nothing. I know when my daughter is hurting." Sandra lowered her head. "Mama, why am I so big?" Mrs. Grace looked at her carefully. Who told you that being big makes you less beautiful? Sandra shook her head. Nobody said it today, but people always laugh at me. They look at me as if something is wrong with me. Mrs. Grace pulled her daughter into her arms. Listen to me, Sandra. There is nothing wrong with you. Your body does not decide your value. Do you understand me? Sandra nodded, but tears continued to fall. A few moments later, Mr. Joseph walked into the room and immediately noticed the sadness on her daughter's face. What happened to my beautiful girl? He asked gently. Sandra looked at him and began crying again. Daddy, why can't I be like other girls? Mr. Joseph sat beside her. Other girls? He asked. Who told you that you must look like somebody else before you can be beautiful? The children laugh at me. Mr. Joseph sighed and held her hand. Sandra, people will always have something to say. If you become slim, someone may say you are too thin. If you dress simply, someone may say you are poor. If you dress beautifully, someone may say you are showing off. You cannot live your life trying to satisfy everybody. Sandra looked at him quietly. Then Mr. Joseph said something she would remember for the rest of her life. Never allow anyone's opinion to become your identity. You are my daughter. You are intelligent, you are kind, you are beautiful, and nothing anyone says can change that. Mrs. Grace nodded. Beauty comes in different forms, my child. Do not spend your whole life standing in front of a mirror looking for reasons to hate yourself. Sandra wiped her tears. But will anybody ever love me? The question broke her parents' hearts. Mrs. Grace held her tighter. Yes, my child. One day, someone will love you for who you are. Mr. Joseph smiled and added, and when that person comes, he will not need you to become somebody else before he sees your worth. Sandra slowly began to grow stronger. She became a confident young woman. She was kind, educated, beautiful, generous, and wealthy. But deep inside her heart, one wound never completely disappeared. She wanted to know what it felt like to be loved by a man. As Sandra grew older, her parents began noticing that she had never brought a man home. It was not because she did not want a relationship, she simply was not approached often. Many men looked at her body before they ever bothered to know her heart. Some would stare and walk away. Others made cruel comments. A few openly called her fat. Sandra always pretended she was fine, but her parents knew better. One evening, Mrs. Grace looked at her husband and said, Joseph, have you noticed that Sandra has never brought anyone home? Mr. Joseph sighed. I have noticed. Do you think she's avoiding relationships? I don't know, he replied. Maybe she is afraid. Mrs. Grace looked worried. Afraid of what? Perhaps she is afraid that nobody will love her. Mrs. Grace became quiet. That thought frightened her. Mr. Joseph also began wondering whether their wealth had become both a blessing and a curse. Their daughter had everything money could buy, but there was one thing money could not give her: genuine love. I just want her to find someone who will love her sincerely, Mrs. Grace said. Mr. Joseph nodded. So do I. But whoever that man is, I want him to love Sandra for Sandra, not for what she has. Unfortunately, neither of them knew that a man was already preparing to enter their daughter's life, and his intentions were far from what they imagined. One day, Sandra went out to buy groceries. As she moved through the store, she noticed a handsome young man approaching her. His name was Kelvin. Sandra became slightly uncomfortable and wondered if he needed something. Excuse me, Kelvin said with a warm smile. Sandra turned toward him. Yes? I hope I'm not disturbing you. No, she replied. I just wanted to tell you something. Sandra waited. Kelvin looked at her and smiled. You are very beautiful. Sandra was stunned. For a moment, she did not know what to say. I'm sorry, she asked, almost as if she had not heard him correctly. Kelvin laughed softly. I said, you're beautiful. Sandra looked away shyly. Thank you. Kelvin continued talking to her confidently. He made her laugh. He complimented her without making her feel uncomfortable. He spoke to her as if her size did not matter at all. And for Sandra, that meant everything. On her way home that day, she kept thinking about him. Was he really talking to me? She wondered. Maybe he actually likes me. What Sandra did not know was that Kelvin's attention had very little to do with love. Before approaching her, he had already noticed the expensive things around her. He had seen the quality of her clothes. He had noticed the car she arrived in. He had observed the confidence with which she moved and the comfort that surrounded her. Kelvin was not looking at Sandra's heart. He was studying her lifestyle. And as he looked at her, one thought quietly formed in his mind. Sandra was wealthy. Kelvin smiled to himself. He believed he had just found his next opportunity. From the moment Kelvin met Sandra, he knew exactly what he wanted. He did not want her love because of the woman she was. He wanted the comfortable life he believed came with her. But Sandra had no idea. To her, Kelvin was the first man who had ever looked at her without making her feel ashamed of her body. So when Kelvin began pursuing her, her heart opened quickly. "Sandra, I have been thinking about you," Kelvin told her one evening. She smiled shyly. "Really? What have you been thinking about?" "About how lucky I would be to have a woman like you in my life." Sandra's heart skipped. Nobody had spoken to her that way before. Kelvin knew exactly what to say. He dressed like a wealthy businessman, wearing clothes that looked expensive, shoes that appeared luxurious, and perfumes that filled the air whenever he walked into a room. What Sandra did not know was that some of the clothes he wore were fake designer clothes, and whenever he needed money to impress her, he borrowed from people and promised to pay them back later. One day, Sandra asked him about his work. "Kelvin, you always talk about business. What exactly do you do?" He smiled confidently. "I own a clothing business." Sandra's eyes brightened. "Really? I would love to see it." Kelvin paused for a second, then smiled. "Of course, I will take you there." The following day, Kelvin took Sandra to a beautiful clothing store owned by his friend Mr. Patrick. Before they entered, Kelvin whispered, "Just relax. I have been building this business for years." Sandra looked around with admiration. "Wow, Kelvin, you never told me your business was this big." Kelvin smiled. "I don't like talking too much about what I have. I prefer to let my work speak for me." Sandra believed every word. She looked at him with admiration, thinking, "Maybe I have finally found someone who understands me." Kelvin continued taking her out. He chose restaurants that looked expensive. He ordered meals he could not afford. He paid bills with borrowed money and made sure Sandra never saw the struggle behind his lifestyle. Whenever he needed money, he called someone and borrowed. "I will pay you back soon," he would promise, "very soon." After every date, Kelvin would return home and count the money he had spent. Sometimes he would shake his head at the amount, but then he would smile. "Once I marry her, I will pay everybody back," he told himself. He was already planning his future with Sandra's wealth. But Sandra knew nothing about his plans. She only saw a handsome man who seemed confident, successful, and deeply interested in her. For the first time in her life, Sandra felt wanted. One evening, she looked at Kelvin and said softly, "Do you really like me?" Kelvin took her hand. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because sometimes I still wonder if this is real." Kelvin smiled. "Sandra, I am not with you because of how you look. I am with you because of who you are." Those words touched the deepest part of her heart. She believed him. She had spent so many years wondering if any man would ever love her that when Kelvin appeared, she held on to his words tightly. Eventually, Kelvin met Sandra's parents. Mr. Joseph watched him carefully from the moment he arrived. He did not easily trust people, and something about Kelvin made him uncomfortable. During their conversation, he asked, "So, Kelvin, what exactly do you do?" Kelvin smiled without hesitation. "Sir, I own a clothing business." "How long have you been in the business?" "For several years." "And what are your plans for the future?" Kelvin answered every question confidently. He spoke about expanding the business, opening more branches, and building a strong future with Sandra. Mr. Joseph listened quietly. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Do you love my daughter?" Kelvin looked directly at Sandra. "With all my heart, sir." Sandra smiled. Mrs. Grace looked at her daughter and saw a happiness she had not seen in a long time. After Kelvin left, Mrs. Grace said, "Joseph, look at Sandra. She is happy." Mr. Joseph remained silent. "I know," he finally said, "but something about that young man bothers me." She looked at him. "What bothers you?" "I cannot explain it." She sighed. "Maybe we should give him a chance." Sandra deserves happiness too. Mr. Joseph looked at his daughter again. He had spent years protecting her from people who might hurt her, but he also feared becoming the father who stood between his daughter and the man she loved. In the end, he allowed his doubts to become quiet. He did not investigate Kelvin deeply enough, and before anyone could discover Kelvin's true identity, the wedding day arrived. It was a magnificent celebration. Sandra looked beautiful and happy. Her face was glowing, and for the first time she believed she had finally found the man she had prayed for. Kelvin stood beside her with a wide smile, pretending to be the happiest man alive. Everyone around them believed they were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful marriage. Sandra's parents spared no expense. They gave the couple cars, landed properties, a luxurious home, and a huge amount of money to begin their new life together. Kelvin appeared overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma. I promise I will take good care of your daughter." Mr. Joseph looked him in the eyes. "That is all I ask. Take care of her." Kelvin nodded. "I will." But inside Kelvin's heart, he was already thinking about the wealth that now surrounded him. He believed he had succeeded. He had married the wealthy woman he wanted, and he thought his luxurious life was secured forever. But shortly after the wedding, something changed. Kelvin's friends began making cruel jokes about Sandra. One evening, several of them laughed as they spoke to him. "Kelvin, you really married her?" one of them asked. Another laughed. "With your looks, you could have married a slimmer woman." Kelvin forced a smile. "Leave it." But their words entered his heart. Instead of defending the woman he had married, Kelvin began feeling ashamed of her. And that shame soon became cruelty. The sweet man Sandra had fallen in love with slowly disappeared. He began speaking to her harshly. "Sandra, why are you eating again?" he asked one evening when he saw her with food. Sandra looked at him in confusion. "I'm hungry, Kelvin. Can't you control yourself?" She put the food down slowly. "Why are you talking to me like this?" Kelvin laughed bitterly. "Because somebody needs to tell you the truth." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "What truth? Look at yourself." She stared at him. "What do you mean? You are getting bigger and bigger, and you still eat like this?" Sandra quietly pushed the plate away. Whenever his friends visited, she would sometimes hear them laughing about her from another room. What hurt her even more was hearing Kelvin laugh with them. One evening, Sandra finally confronted him. "Kelvin, why do you allow your friends to speak about me like that?" Kelvin looked annoyed. "Don't start. I am your wife. So what? I deserve respect." Kelvin scoffed. "Don't talk to me like you're some important woman." Sandra stared at him in disbelief. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." He walked away, then turned back and added, "Sometimes I hate being addressed as your husband." Sandra felt as if someone had struck her. "Kelvin, why would you say that to me?" He looked at her coldly. "Because I am too handsome for a fat woman like you." Those words destroyed something inside Sandra. The insecurity she had fought since childhood came rushing back. That night, she stood in front of the mirror and remembered the children who had laughed at her years ago. She remembered asking herself why she was so big. She remembered her father's words telling her never to let anyone's opinion become her identity. But now, the man she loved was saying the same things she had spent her entire life trying to escape. Whenever they had an occasion to attend, Kelvin chose her clothes himself. He deliberately bought dresses that were too small and expected her to somehow fit into them. "Kelvin, this dress is too tight," Sandra would complain. "Then lose weight." "But I cannot lose weight in a few days." "Then don't eat." Sandra would stare at him. "You want me to starve myself? If you embarrass me outside, I will never forgive you." Sometimes Sandra would go for days eating very little because she desperately wanted Kelvin to look at her with love again. She kept telling herself, maybe if I become smaller, he will change. Maybe he will become the man I married. She cried quietly when Kelvin was not watching. She wanted her marriage to work. She wanted to be loved. She wanted to believe that the sweet man she first met was still somewhere inside him. But she did not understand one painful truth. Kelvin's problem was never Sandra's body. His problem was his character. And while Sandra was quietly suffering, Mr. Joseph was beginning to notice that something was terribly wrong with her daughter. Mr. Joseph was the first to notice that something had changed in Sandra. His cheerful daughter no longer laughed the way she used to. She avoided family gatherings, constantly checked her body in the mirror, and seemed nervous whenever Kelvin was around. One day, Mrs. Grace asked her, "Sandra, why do you keep looking at yourself like that?" Sandra sighed. "Kelvin doesn't like my body." Those words troubled Mr. Joseph deeply. "Grace," he told his wife after Kelvin left, "our daughter is afraid of her own husband." From that moment, Mr. Joseph began quietly investigating Kelvin. What he discovered shocked him. The clothing business Kelvin claimed to own actually belonged to his friend, Mr. Patrick. Kelvin had almost no real source of income, had accumulated debts, and had borrowed money to maintain the image of a wealthy businessman. Worst of all, Mr. Joseph discovered that Kelvin had married Sandra because of her wealth. "He used our daughter," Mr. Joseph said bitterly. Mrs. Grace covered her mouth in disbelief. "We have to tell Sandra." "We will," Mr. Joseph replied, "but first, I want him to expose himself." He then brought Sophia into the plan. Sophia was beautiful, intelligent, and confident. Mr. Joseph explained what he needed. "Get close to Kelvin. Let him believe you are interested in him. I need him to reveal the truth himself." Sophia agreed. Soon, Kelvin became interested in her. He secretly met her, bought her gifts, and gave her money. Sophia eventually asked, "What about your wife?" Kelvin laughed. "I don't love Sandra. I married her because of her money." Sophia calmly continued asking questions while secretly recording him. Kelvin became careless. He admitted that he was ashamed of Sandra's body and wanted to leave her. "If I had enough money," he told Sophia, "I would disappear with you and start a new life in another country." When Mr. Joseph received the recordings, he knew he had enough evidence. He immediately called Sandra. "Daddy, what happened?" she asked. Mr. Joseph handed her his phone. "Listen to this." Sandra heard Kelvin laughing about her. Then she heard him say, "I married her because of her money. I don't love her." Tears filled Sandra's eyes, but she did not scream. She simply sat there in silence. Finally, she whispered, "Daddy, I think I already knew. I just didn't want to accept it." Mr. Joseph held her hand. "I'm sorry, my child." Sandra shook her head. "Don't be. I'll handle this." From that day, Sandra stopped begging Kelvin for love. Instead, she quietly began taking back what belonged to our family. She removed his access to accounts, recovered properties where possible, and reversed financial arrangements. Kelvin noticed nothing. He was too busy planning his future with Sophia. He believed he had already won. Sandra, meanwhile, smiled and acted as if everything was normal. Then one morning she woke Kelvin. "Get up." He frowned. "Why?" "Leave this house." Kelvin burst into laughter. "Sandra, have you gone crazy?" She looked at him calmly. "I'm serious." He mocked her. "Where do you think I will go?" Anywhere you want, just not here." Then Sandra looked toward the door. It opened. Mr. Joseph entered, followed by Mrs. Grace, Mr. Daniel, the family lawyer, and several security officers. Kelvin's smile disappeared. "What is this?" he asked nervously. Before anyone answered, another person entered. Kelvin turned toward the door, and the moment he saw her, his face went pale. It was Sophia. Kelvin stared at Sophia, and the smile disappeared from his face. "Sophia," he whispered. She looked at him without emotion. Mr. Joseph stepped forward. "Yes, Kelvin, Sophia is here because she has something to tell you." Kelvin looked around nervously. "What is going on?" Mr. Joseph answered coldly. "Everything you thought you were hiding." He revealed the recordings, the money Kelvin had been giving Sophia, the lies about his business and his plans to abandon Sandra. Kelvin shook his head. "No, this is a misunderstanding." Sophia finally spoke. "There is no misunderstanding, Kelvin. I was working with Mr. Joseph from the beginning." Kelvin's face went pale. "You?" "Yes," Sophia replied. "Every conversation you had with me was recorded." Kelvin's legs suddenly became weak. He looked at Mr. Joseph. "What about the money I gave her?" "It has already been returned to Sandra's family," Mr. Joseph said. Kelvin stared at Sophia in disbelief. The woman he thought was his escape route had been the trap all along. His knees gave way and he dropped to the floor. Then he turned towards Sandra. The woman he had insulted, humiliated, and treated like she was worthless was now the only person who could possibly help him. "Sandra, please," he begged. "I made mistakes. I was wrong. Please forgive me." Sandra remained silent. Kelvin crawled closer. "I will change. I promise. I love you." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she remembered everything. Every time he called her fat, every meal he told her not to eat, every dress he forced her to squeeze into, every time his friends laughed at her while he joined them, every time he told her he was ashamed to be her husband. She suddenly laughed. It was not laughter from happiness. It was the laughter of someone who had finally realized that the person who once made her feel powerless had become completely powerless himself. Kelvin looked at her desperately. "Sandra, please." She wiped the tears from her eyes and turned to Security Chief Michael. "Take him outside." Kelvin's face collapsed. "Sandra, don't do this." But she did not change her mind. Michael and the other security officers escorted Kelvin out. Within moments, the luxurious home, cars, properties, money, and lifestyle he had enjoyed through Sandra were gone. He was left with only basic clothing and enough transportation money to leave. The same man who once told Sandra he was too handsome for her was now walking away with almost nothing. Kelvin went to Patrick, hoping his old friend would help him. At first, Patrick allowed him to stay, but Kelvin quickly returned to his old ways. He refused to work, complained about everything, and expected Patrick to provide food and shelter. One day, Patrick finally lost patience. "Kelvin, you cannot spend your entire life depending on other people." Kelvin frowned. "Where do you expect me to go?" Patrick shook his head. "Anywhere you choose, but you cannot stay here and refuse to work." Kelvin begged him, but Patrick stood firm and eventually sent him away. For the first time in years, Kelvin was completely alone. There was no wealthy wife to manipulate, no money to spend, no luxury car, no expensive clothes, and no fake business to hide behind. He had finally lost everything he never truly earned, and now he was forced to face the one person he had been running from all along, himself. Back at home, Sandra finally broke down. She cried against her mother's shoulder, not because she regretted leaving Kelvin, but because she wished she had never experienced such cruelty from someone she trusted. Mrs. Grace held her tightly. "Cry, my child. Let everything out." Mr. Joseph sat beside them and gently held Sandra's hand. "Sandra, none of Kelvin's words define you. You were beautiful before Kelvin met you. You remained beautiful while he insulted you, and you are still beautiful now." Sandra cried harder. "Daddy, I don't know why I kept trying to make him love me." Mr. Joseph shook his head. "Because you had a good heart, but never again should you beg someone to see your worth." Mrs. Grace wiped her daughter's tears. "One day, you will meet someone who loves you without conditions, someone who will see your heart before anything else." Later, Mr. Joseph thanked Sophia for helping expose Kelvin and paid her generously. "You helped protect my daughter," he told her. Sophia smiled. "I am glad I could help." But the real victory was not the money Sophia received. It was the fact that Kelvin's manipulation had finally been exposed. After the separation, Sandra made a decision. She would no longer spend her life trying to become thinner just to earn someone's love. She decided to work on herself, not because she hated her body, but because she wanted to become healthier, stronger, happier, and more confident. She began taking better care of herself. She wore clothes she actually liked and stopped dressing to please other people. One morning, she stood before the mirror and looked at herself for a long moment. For years, she asked, "Am I beautiful enough?" But that morning, she smiled and whispered, "I am enough." Slowly, her confidence returned. She laughed again. She spent more time with her parents and began pursuing the things that made her happy. She finally understood what Kelvin had never understood. Her worth had never been determined by her body. One day, she remembered the woman who had once stood in front of a mirror desperately trying to squeeze herself into a tiny dress because Kelvin was ashamed of her size. Sandra looked at herself again, but this time she was wearing something comfortable and beautiful. She smiled. She did not squeeze her waist. She did not starve herself. She did not ask anyone for permission to feel beautiful. She simply smiled at her reflection and walked away with confidence. Sandra had once believed she needed Kelvin to prove that she was lovable, but his betrayal taught her something far more valuable. She had not lost a good husband. She had lost a man who never deserved her. And sometimes, losing someone who constantly makes you feel worthless is the beginning of finding yourself. Never allow another person's opinion to define your worth. Sandra spent years believing her body made her less desirable, but Kelvin's cruelty had nothing to do with her worth. Money cannot buy genuine love. Kelvin married Sandra for wealth, but everything he gained through deception eventually disappeared. Never ignore red flags because you are afraid of being alone. Sandra overlooked warning signs because she desperately wanted to experience love. And never assume that a beautiful face means a beautiful heart. Kelvin was handsome on the outside, but his character was selfish, lazy, manipulative, and cruel. Mr. Joseph also learned a painful lesson. Love for your child is not enough. Sometimes you must investigate the character of the person entering your family. Most importantly, humiliation is not love. Anyone who constantly insults your body, destroys your confidence, or makes you feel worthless is not loving you. Sandra also learned that self-improvement should come from self-love, not from someone's rejection. She was no longer changing because Kelvin hated her. She was growing because she had finally learned to love herself. And perhaps the greatest lesson was this: sometimes silence is not weakness. Sandra's silence became preparation. She quietly gathered her strength, reclaimed her life, and walked away. Kelvin thought Sandra could never live without him. He was wrong. She did not just survive without him. She finally learned to love herself without needing anyone's approval. Kelvin thought he married Sandra because of her money. He never imagined that one day, the same woman he mocked for her body would be the woman who took back everything he had gained through deception. But perhaps the greatest victory was not taking his money back. It was watching Sandra finally look in the mirror and realize that she had never been the problem.